Good morning and a warm welcome to the 21st meeting of the Constitution, Europe, External Affairs and Culture Committee in 2025. Our first agenda item is a declaration of interests. As a result of membership change, we are welcoming today Jamie Harcourt-Johnson to the committee, and we would like to extend our thanks to Alexander Stewart for his contribution to the committee's work and wish him well in his new role. And I now invite Jamie Harcourt-Johnson to make a declaration of interests.
Thank you very much, Convener. I have no interests which relate to the work of this committee.
Thank you. Our next agenda item is to choose a deputy convener. The Parliament has agreed that only members of the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party are eligible for nomination as deputy convener. I understand that Jamie Harcourt-Johnson, MSP, is the party's nominee. Does any member disagree with that nomination? Thank you. I congratulate and welcome Jamie Harcourt-Johnson to his new appointment as Deputy Convener of the Constitution, Europe, External Affairs and Culture Committee. Welcome. Our next agenda item this morning is to take evidence on the desecration of War Memorials Scotland Bill, and we are joined in the room by Megan Gallagher, MSP, the proposer and member in charge of the bill, Neil Stewart, Senior Clerk, Non-Government Bills Unit, Sean Tanney, Assistant Clerk, Non-Government Bills Unit, and Kirsty Lauder, Solicitor, Legal Services at the Scottish Parliament. And I would like to invite Ms Gallagher to make a short opening statement before moving to questions from members.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, everyone. A war memorial is a centre point of many a community's life. People gather round it on Remembrance Sunday to pay their respects, to remember those who gave their lives in conflict so that our communities may enjoy peace and freedom, and to pay tribute to those who have served in wars. To many individuals and groups, particularly serving armed forces personnel, veterans and bereaved families, war memorials carry special meaning and significance. To some bereaved relatives and friends of people who have lost their lives in war, but whose bodies were never recovered or repatriated, a war memorial is symbolic of a gravesite. Many veterans and armed forces groups have taken on the role of custodians of war memorials. They clean the stone, they place flower beds and ensure the surrounding area is kept tidy. I pay tribute to all groups involved in maintaining the upkeep of our war memorials. Any attack on a war memorial, however large or small, is egregious, it's cruel, offensive and re-traumatising for those who have lost loved ones in conflict or who have served or are serving themselves. In some cases, the vandalism of desecration of a war memorial would be categorised as a heritage crime. In practice, the offence is most likely to be charged and prosecuted under the statutory offence of vandalism or the common law crime of malicious mischief. Those matters are generally prosecuted in the Justice of the Peace and Sheriff Courts, and there are limits in respect of sentences that can be handed down or fine levels issued. Whilst these sentencing options are appropriate for most instances of vandalism, they do not allow for courts to consider higher penalties which would deter acts of desecration against war memorials and provide adequate redress for the distress caused to individuals and communities as a result of such acts. The costs to local authorities for repairing and cleaning a defaced or damaged war memorial account to thousands of pounds. This is due to specialised stone masonry involved in treating the stone and the skills required to restore them. The question I have for all committee members today is this: do they believe that vandalism of a war memorial should be treated the exact same way as vandalism of a lamppost or a telephone box? In short, I do not believe that the current criminal law adequately takes account of the impact of desecration of a war memorial on the people and communities for whom the memorial has significant and symbolic meaning. This is why I consider that there should be a specific statutory offence of desecration of a war memorial with options for higher penalties to be handed down by courts than those which are available at the present, thereby creating a stronger deterrent. Ultimately, the sanctions will be for the courts to decide. However, I want to give them a range of options and for the law for more appropriately to reflect the seriousness of this particular crime. As committee members may be aware, the UK Parliament has already legislated in this area through the Police, Crime and Sentencing in Courts Act 2022. This followed a private member's bill from then MP Jonathan Gullis, which would have created an offence of desecrating a war memorial. Turning to the provisions of my bill is a short 3-section bill with one substantive section. Section 1 of the bill inserts a new section, Section 52A, into Criminal Law Consolidation Scotland Act 1995. Section 1 of the inserted Section 52A establishes an offence of desecration of war memorial. This means that any person who willingly or recklessly destroys, damages or desecrates a war memorial commits an offence unless they have a reasonable excuse. What constitutes a reasonable excuse would be determined by the courts on a case-by-case basis. However, an example might be someone who is working on a war memorial, for example, to clean or maintain it, accidentally causing damage to it in their course of work. Subsection 2 sets out what desecrating a war memorial means. It includes, but is not limited to, spitting, urinating or defecating on a memorial or otherwise defacing it. This includes both temporary and permanent damage. Subsection 3 sets out penalties of the new offence. These are, on summary conviction, up to 12 months in prison and or a fine up to the statutory maximum. The maximum fine is £2,500 in a Justice of the Peace Court and £10,000 in the Sheriff Court. On conviction of indictment, up to 10 years in prison and or an unlimited fine. Subsection 4 provides definitions for the terms used in the bill. The definition of war memorial draws heavily on the definition of memorial in Section 50 of the Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Act 2022. This subsection also makes clear that land does not include land over which the access rights are not exercisable under Section 6 of the Land Reform Scotland Act 2003. My intention is to exclude war memorials in private homes and gardens from the scope of the new offence. Committee members will be aware that I have written to the committee about this matter. After introduction, I became aware of a potential unintended consequence of this provision, namely that this may exclude war memorials within places of worship on their grounds, and this would be private land. As indicated in my letter, should the bill proceed to stage 2, I plan to lodge an amendment to change this to ensure that war memorials in places of worship or their grounds would be protected by the provisions of the bill, as well as any other places that would appropriately fall within the provisions of the bill. As the bill relates to war memorials rather than memorials more generally, this subsection sets out what is meant to be something of having a commemorative purpose in respect of armed conflict, making clear that at least one of the memorial's purposes must be to commemorate one or more individuals or animals, or particular description or category of individuals or animals who died in armed conflict. Finally, sections 2 and 3 of the bill are the commencement and short title provisions. I hope that this gives a clear overview of the bill and policy development underpinning, and it has been helpful to committee members. I look forward to taking any questions and to the committee's stage 1 scrutiny of the bill more generally. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Gallagher. I wonder if I could reflect on what you said. There have been 2 previous petitions urging the Scottish Government to introduce legislation that recognises desecration or vandalism of war memorials as a specific offence. Most recently, the Scottish Government said at that time, quote, "There is legislation currently in place to deal with vandalism and desecration of statues and memorials, including war memorials," and that the Government had no current plans to introduce new legislation for the specific purpose requested on the petition. Can I ask you, have things changed more recently, or why you think now is the time that this should be revisited?
Thank you very much, Convener. And as I said within my opening statement, destroying, damaging or desecrating war memorials not only has a financial impact on local authorities who are having to look after and maintain and restore the war memorial, but also the communities, armed forces communities, veterans, but actually the wider community who know of and are very fond of war memorials in their area for obvious reasons, given that it's people who have served and died for our freedoms that we enjoy today. When I embarked on the bill process back in 2021, in this year alone there were 6 attacks, and in April 2021 you had the Carnshore War Memorial attack. April 21 again was the Boar Memorial in Glasgow. June 2021 was the Spanish War Memorial in Motherwell. September 2021, Kirkcaldy War Memorial. October 2021, Cowdenbeath War Memorial. And October 2021, Preston Pans. So I think that shows that even when I was beginning to embark on this piece of legislation, there was a pattern happening now. And I'm not saying that that happens every year. It seems to be when there's particular acts of civil unrest or there's something happening here in Scotland. However, it shows you just in that short space of time how many attacks can happen on war memorials in the one place. I fully believe that Denniston War Memorial, when they brought the petition to the Scottish Parliament, had identified a gap in the legislation. What I aim to do with this legislation is to escalate and raise the status of war memorials so that they're not akin to vandalism of a lamppost or a telephone box, that they are of a higher status given not only their cultural importance, but of course the importance that it is to communities as well in relation to the emotional impact that they feel whenever a war memorial is desecrated. I believe that it is important that law should recognise that damaging a war memorial has got consequences beyond littering and the vandalism aspect, and I'm hoping that we will be able to get into that later on, and that it does cause significant trauma to communities who are impacted when they see a war memorial being desecrated. Again, if I can relate back to the statutory offence which is now in force in England and Wales, what I'm trying to do in many respects is bring my bill, if it passes through stage 1, stage 2 and stage 3, to bring it into line with what's happening in other areas of the UK.
Okay. And of the examples that you gave, were the police able to have any prosecutions associated with those particular incidents?
I do not have that information in front of me today. I'd be happy to follow up with the committee on that particular information. However, it's to give you an insight in terms of how many attacks can happen over a short period of time. And that was when we were beginning to research on the bill itself. But of course, there has been attacks either before or after this particular series of attacks that I've been able to highlight at committee this morning.
Thank you. I'm going to move to questions from committee. Mr. Halgrove Johnson.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Megan, for coming in and speaking to us. I've got a number of fairly short questions, but I know from my own parish where I live in Orkney, the War Memorial, it's a small memorial with only a smaller number of people on, but almost every community as part of our parish is represented on that. And I know from my inbox how many communities get very upset when there isn't proper maintenance of the War Memorial or there's issues that threaten it in some way. So there is obviously that very, very strong emotional tie to it. And it's a place of gathering for a lot of people, often once a year, but sometimes more than that. Can I just kind of ask, I recognise the kind of public feel about it, but can you tell us a little bit more about some of the correspondence you've had from public or other bodies, such as Veterans Charities or other bodies that may be relevant, and what their thoughts are?
Thank you very much for your question. You'll see today that I'm not here myself. I'm joined by veterans groups, veterans charities and Friends of War Memorial groups who feel very passionately about this issue. They don't want to see any more war memorials being desecrated here in Scotland. And that's the aim of my bill, is to create a deterrent, to make sure that people are aware that if they do desecrate a war memorial under the definitions that I have set out within the bill, that there will be consequences for that. And I think when you're looking at the community impact that desecrating a war memorial has, I think it's very interesting that today, as a committee, when we're looking at this bill, every single area that we all represent, whether that be region or constituency, has had a war memorial desecrated within it. And I think that shows you that we're not an isolated, it's not an isolated area where war memorials are desecrated, it's actually widespread throughout the full country. If I can refer back to paragraph 15 of the policy memorandum, the research that I carried out on the process of putting the bill together shows that there has been 66 attacks on war memorials reported since 1996. And there has been, 70% of those have occurred since 2014. So that shows you that there has been a bit of a spike within the last 10 years. And I thought 10 years was an appropriate time frame to look at in terms of where we are and where I think that there could be further incidents of desecrating war memorials in the future. On the community impact itself, there's an average, I would say, about 4 or 5 attacks each year, and that might not seem a lot, but of course the impact that that has on the community is stark. If I can refer to the pro-fascist graffiti that was dubbed on the Duchess Park War Memorial in my own region in Motherwell back in 2019, and of course there was the petrol bombing of the War Memorial in Alexandra Park in 2018, and that was even before it was meant to be unveiled, so that's a relatively new war memorial, but still suffered desecration at the hands of vandals. But if I can refer back again to the Duchess of Hamilton Park War Memorial, which is one that myself, other members of this committee, of course, were very forthright in condemning, and rightly so. What was written on that war memorial, I can't put into words how disgusting it was. Rats was etched into the stone. You had scum of the earth that was written in a permanent marker. You had cowards written above the names of armed forces personnel who died serving our country. I don't think you can put into words how disgusting that is, and the impact that that is going to have not only on ancestors of people, of families, of ancestors who are etched onto those stones, but of course armed forces personnel who gather at those memorials on a regular basis throughout the course of the year for many different events. On that particular incident, it was called out by the veterans community, and rightly so. Rose Gentle, who I'm sure needs no introduction for the campaigning work that she has done for her own son, Gordon Gentle, in her campaign Justice for Gordon Gentle. She said at the time, no matter who you are or what you believe in, there is no need for this. And again, Cammy McLeod of Veterans Charity Who Dares Care said, for someone to go out and do this days after D-Day commemorations is an utter disgrace. So I guess the question that I'm putting back to the committee is, do they believe that desecration of a war memorial deserves a higher potential higher sentence? Do they believe that it believes a higher status, so it's got further protections? I know in my heart the answer is yes, given what's happened to communities and how communities have felt on the back of war memorials being desecrated in their area.
Thank you very much. Can I just come to some technical questions as well?
Yes.
Just I suppose around the kind of increased threat. Will your bill? I mean, there will be occasions when war memorials are targeted, but not necessarily damaged. So, for example, a group may choose to protest at a war memorial, or in some other way use it as part of almost an inflammatory protest. Is there anything in your bill that would cover that? Is that something that could be under consideration or would be under consideration?
It is something that I would consider. So again, in subsection 2 of the bill, it provides that desecration includes, but is not limited to, the spitting, urinating and defecating upon, otherwise defacing, whether that's temporary damage or more permanent damage, a war memorial. So if I could take the example of urinating, whilst urinating is of course not going to be permanent damage to a war memorial, it's the intent behind it. It's the reason why someone feels the need to go and do that, and of course the emotional impact that that is going to have on communities thereafter. I do believe that there is the right to protest. That's something that I believe, we all believe in. But again, if it's a protest to then go and deliberately deface and damage a war memorial that is of significant importance, not just for our armed forces community veterans, but for the wider community as well, I don't think that is acceptable, and therefore it would be for the courts to decide through the sentencing process, through that court process, what the correct penalties would be. Of course, what I'm trying to do here is give the courts additional levers. So if they believe that the desecration is of such severity that they actually have the mechanism that they could put in place tougher sentences than what we have at present.
Thanks. A number of other organisations. I know you're looking at bringing in a stage 2 amendment to reduce some of the exclusions, I suppose, or include other organisations. Would those include places like schools or sports clubs that have war memorials or memorials to those former pupils or former members, etc., that have fallen?
It is an important point that you raise, and again, you know, within the scope of the bill, I tried to make it as direct as possible, not just given the time limitations that we have here in the Scottish Parliament for private members' bill, but of course making sure that it was an easily understood bill that had a direct aim and objective. I'd be willing to have discussions on this at stage 2 because we've identified places of worship, of course, was not included within the scope of the bill itself. So these issues, you know, could be ironed out at stage 2. And I'd be happy to have discussions with members on this as well, because I know that war memorials could be within those premises as well.
And just lastly, obviously, I represent the Highlands and Islands. You talked about the kind of the spread, and you know there are already great pressures on policing and our court system. Do you have any concerns that sometimes the issues around rurality may be a problem, and also you know where there are cases, you know whether they will be prosecuted even if the legislation is in place?
I think it's fair points that you raise in relation to rurality, of course, being one of those issues. What I'm hoping to do with this bill is create the deterrent. I don't want to cause a backlog in our court systems, and I think my bill is strong enough that it could create that deterrent that we need in Scotland to make sure that we're not seeing the numbers of desecrations of war memorials that we have seen in recent years. That is the primary objective of what I'm trying to achieve, and hopefully members will be able to see that that's what I'm hoping to do within the scope of my bill. I also understand that there will maybe be one or two examples depending on how severe the desecration of a war memorial is, that would end up being a higher sentence. But of course, if I can refer you to my financial memorandum, my financial memorandum for this particular member's bill is low. So that shows you that I don't envisage there being a huge impact on our court system, and I hope that gives some comfort to the committee this morning as well.
Thanks, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. Just before we continue, I feel I need to declare an interest, given you've mentioned the Duchess Park, as my great-uncle was on that war memorial that was desecrated, and I was also a supporter of the Ní Pasaran fundraising and the trade unionists that were able to establish that memorial as well in my constituency. I'm now going to bring in Mr Kerr.
I think, in a way, just your comments just now underpin something that Megan Gallagher is presenting to us about the significance of these places. Because my question is very simple, almost redundant now, I fear. But before I ask it, I do want to pay tribute to the Friends of Dennistoun War Memorial, who have constantly striven to raise this issue and to seek this special level of protection for war memorials in Scotland. And I pay tribute to them. And in relation to the damage that was done at Carron Shore, which is a part of the Central Scotland regional constituency that I know well, I'm pretty sure no one ever was convicted. And I think that's part of my concern about the whole issue, is that I'm not sure that anyone ever seems to get prosecuted. But setting that aside, can you just tell us clearly why you feel that this merits a standalone offence? And I'll just kind of segue that by saying, in England, you mentioned Jonathan Gullis's private member's bill, which the government in 2022, I think you said 2022, yes, then kind of took over and inserted amendments to a bill that was a government bill going through the House of Commons, House of Lords. So there isn't a standalone bill measure in England. Why do you think there should be in Scotland?
It's through the work that I've undertaken alongside my friends of Dennistoun War Memorial Group. I think that the work that they've undertaken and the efforts they have made to try and make this a standalone offence, something that we should, all applaud them for, because again, it's taken a long time to get to this point, and it's only through working with them that I have truly understood the impact that this has on people, on communities, on our veterans and on our armed forces. And again, when you look at this in the round, the reason that Jonathan Gullis's private member's bill was absorbed into the Crime Act, which I was hoping that I perhaps would be able to do within a piece of legislation this session. Unfortunately, I haven't found any vehicles or mechanisms for me to do that, just given the bills that have come forward. If there was an opportunity for me to do that, I absolutely would have done through amendments. However, it's just not been afforded just in terms of legislation that has been brought forward this parliamentary term. If I can just reflect just more broadly on the Section 50 of the Police Crime and Sentencing in Courts Act, because the definitions, I think it's important here. I'm trying to use those definitions within the bill that I am bringing forward. Again, had there been an amendment that I could have put it into other legislation, I absolutely would have, but this is why I've had to embark on this private member's bill process to make it a standalone offence. However, I do believe that war memorials deserve this level of protection. I do believe, given the research that I've undertaken and have presented, that there has been a pattern of desecration of war memorials of different types of severity. However, again, there could be an opportunity through this bill to highlight again the significance of our war memorials, particularly as we're heading up to Remembrance Sunday, but of course all of the other important memorial events that take place throughout the course of the year that relate to our armed forces and our veterans community, but of course most importantly remembering what people who are on those war memorials fought and died for.
And you mentioned the Police Crime Sentencing Courts Act 2022, which doesn't specifically mention war memorials, but it's more broad. It encompasses all memorials. Your bill's very narrow.
Yes.
And the reason for that is?
So the reason for that is to ensure that we're looking at the issue at hand, which is desecration of war memorials, which is the issue that has been presented to me through Dennistoun War Memorial Group and others who are very concerned about the number of war memorials who are desecrated. So I wanted to make sure that my bill was direct as possible. I wanted to make sure that there was no manoeuvre for other sort of interpretations of the bill. I just wanted to make sure that it was very fixed and to the point in terms of what my aims and objectives are, which is of course to give courts more levers, but also to act as the deterrent so people will not continue to deface and desecrate our war memorials.
And the additional levers include this, basically up to 10 years in prison and up to £10,000 in fines. That seems onerous. Is there a reason? I mean, I understand the deterrent argument that you might be about to make, but is there a particular reason why the extent of these potential sanctions and punishments are what they are?
Yes, again, and I think you've hit the nail on the head there. It is the deterrent that I'm trying to bring in, and I do believe that war memorials, given their significant importance, I do believe, that they deserve a higher status of protection. And I believe that can be done through what I'm trying to achieve here. But I also, I mean, I've got to put on the record here that I don't believe that necessarily someone would be handed a 10-year sentence for desecrating a war memorial. That's not for me to determine, of course. That's for the courts to decide. However, I can't see that being, crime and punishment for every single case that is brought forward. It would obviously determine on the severity, and it would also determine, how the war memorial was vandalised or damaged or desecrated.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr Bibby.
Thank you, Convener. First, I would just say, completely agree with your opening comments that any attack on war memorials are cruel and offensive and deeply disrespectful, and we do not want to see them happening in any part of Scotland. I just wanted to ask you, you talked a lot about creating a deterrent. I just wanted to ask you, to what extent do we also need education? Because, and I'd be interested to know out of the number of attacks that there have been on war memorials, to what extent have they been organised, politically motivated attacks versus people who should really know better, who have done something really stupid. To what extent do you think the balance between those two groups is, and that we need education as well as a deterrent to stop these things from happening?
It's a really interesting point, and I considered education as part of the bill when I was piecing the bill together. The reason we decided not to go down that route was because it was a bit complex for the bill that I was trying to bring forward. However, I think in many instances, particularly if it's younger people who have desecrated a war memorial, education is fundamental. It wouldn't necessarily be a custodial sentence or sentencing through the courts. I think there could be other mechanisms put in place that would help educate that individual that desecrating a war memorial is wrong, and of course the impact that it has on the wider community as well. So I don't believe that it's one or the other. I think it could be blended. Yeah. And again, I hope that through the bill that I'm bringing forward, it raises awareness of the importance of our war memorials. And again, there could perhaps be some educational work done around that, raising the awareness, raising war memorials in general, but actually making people interested in their own heritage, their own history within their local areas. I think that's hugely important. So I agree exactly with what you're saying. And for me, depending on how the crime was committed, how it was done, I think that we do need to look at other ways in which we can educate people. And of course, there is the role of community payback as well, which could be helping to, restore, repair the war memorial as well.
And it's on that, and I repeat, I think any attacks on war memorials are deeply disrespectful, and we should do everything we can to, eradicate the scourge of attacks on war memorials. But in terms of that balance between deterrent and education, you mentioned community payback orders, because I think that's really interesting, because some people may say that we have these war memorials remembering the sacrifice, the duty that so many generations of our countrymen and women have made to this country in terms of protecting our freedoms. And then potentially this bill, in terms of the desecration of war memorials, could take away people's freedoms from up to 10 years. And some people may feel uncomfortable about that in the sense that those who have fought for our freedom, we should be focusing more on the community payback orders, because at the end of the day, our veterans and people who have fought for this country have paid huge service to this country. And in actual fact, that would be more of an appropriate sentence for the most severe forms of attacks on war memorials than a custodial sentence for up to 10 years.
So again, it comes back into the deterrent argument that I've been making this morning, because I can't see there being many circumstances where someone would receive that lengthy sentence on the back of desecrating a war memorial. However, that we can't rule it out given what we've seen in recent times. And again, it goes back to the scale of the damage. It goes back to how the crime was committed. But of course, that would be for the courts to determine. What I'm trying to do here is bring the penalties that are now in force in England and Wales up here to Scotland. So we're basically mirroring right across the UK. I get what you're saying, and I think in many circumstances that there would be community payback orders, given it could be something, as I mentioned earlier on, in terms of defecating, urinating. I think there could be elements there, but again, that's not for me to determine. That would be through the sentencing courts process, and I think that would be due process to allow them to determine what the outcome of that would be. But going back to the education point, I wholeheartedly agree. And again, this could be a discussion, moving into stage 2, should the bill achieve and progress at stage 1.
Thank you, Camilla.
Okay. Can I just pick up on Neil's question, which I think he was alluding to, that it might be a young person just misbehaving, not really realising in their own mind the severity of what's happening. But your equality impact assessment suggests a neutral impact in terms of age. So I just wondered if what your thinking was there about younger people in this scenario.
Well, what I don't want to do is put anyone into a box, and I think it would be very unfair, just to come out and say, oh well, it's if a war memorial is desecrated, then it would automatically be a younger person or someone of a certain age bracket. I think that's wholeheartedly unfair, because we've seen in many different examples that it's people from all ages, all backgrounds. So I don't want to put people into a box, and I think through looking at certain instances, which I have done through my own research, there are certain reasons why people decide to go and desecrate a war memorial. And I think you've got to look at that in isolation in terms of a case-by-case basis. It's not something that you can put a blanket on and say, you've desecrated that war memorial, so you are ultimately a terrible person. It could be as a lack of education that we've just been discussing. It could be mental health. There's a lot of other things that could encompass a reason why someone desecrates a war memorial. So you've got to look at this as a whole. The reason I did say neutral was for that purpose, because I believe that these are, usually in silo. But as I said, they usually seem to happen at heightened points in society, and we've seen that, in recent times, because there's 2019, that was the beginning of the pandemic. 2021, of course, we were still in that space. So it seems to be at certain times that war memorials are desecrated more frequently. And again, what I'm trying to do is raise the status of war memorials, but make sure that we have a robust court process should we believe that the crime is sufficient.
Thank you. Patrick.
Thank you very much. Good morning to the witnesses. I'm going to touch very briefly on the sentencing issue that others have mentioned, but most of my questions will be about the scope of the bill, what it applies to. I welcome the fact that you're placing some emphasis in your answers so far on lower level penalties like community payback orders, which might well be often appropriate. But I'm concerned about the upper limit that you've suggested of 10 years. There are people convicted of multiple offences of trafficking Class A drugs who are sentenced to less than that. Now, you might generally have a view that sentencing should be higher. I don't know. Maybe you do. But is that really a fair comparison? Is there not some concern that you place the upper limit too high?
No, I don't have concerns there, because again, it would depend on the severity of the crime. Now, I don't believe that, for example, the crimes that we've discussed this morning in relation to the permanent marker, in relation to urinating, defecating, would amount to a 10-year sentence. However, if it was the case that a war memorial was completely destroyed, that would be for the courts to determine what level of sentencing would be delivered in that instance. Now, I'm not going to say that there might not ever be a case where someone, if this bill passes, reaches that 10-year scope. But again, that's not for me to determine at this point. I take your point. I do take your point in relation to concerns. However, I do believe that we have to create a strong deterrent given what we've witnessed in recent times. I mean, I think that 70% increase since 2014 really tells us a story. It tells us a story that people are willingly going out and desecrating war memorials, and I'm trying to, as much as possible, put a stop to that. Okay. And it's to protect the community, of course, who are impacted by, not just emotionally, but of course, by the symbolic significance of desecrating a war memorial.
Okay, thank you for the answer. I think perhaps it relies on the idea that high sentences are an effective deterrent to crime in general. Personally, I would question whether there's robust evidence of that across the criminal justice system, but that's perhaps something we can explore as the bill goes on. Mm-hmm. Can I ask then about scope and about what the offence in the bill would apply to? Can I first of all say, you've very clearly articulated, I think you used the word trauma, the emotional impact, the social, cultural and emotional significance of the memorials you're talking about. And I hope it goes without saying that the whole committee, and I suspect the whole Parliament, would take that very seriously and very much respect that. It does seem to me that the same argument applies to a wider range of memorials or structures, entities, call it what we will, than the ones that you've covered in the bill. The bill, I think, uses the term, sorry, I've got it in front of me, something has a commemorative purpose in respect of armed conflict if at least one of its purposes is to commemorate one or more individuals or animals or a particular description or category of individuals or animals who died in armed conflict. The Second World War is clearly an armed conflict. The Holocaust, specifically, one of the greatest atrocities in modern human history, an act of genocide, but seen in isolation, would it be seen as an armed conflict? Would a Holocaust memorial be covered in the legislation here or not?
I think it's an interesting point. If I may touch upon the inserted section that I put in at 52A4D that provides that something has a commemorative purpose in respect of armed conflict of at least one of its purposes to commemorate one or more individuals or animals. And what I'm trying to do in terms of the definitions that I've drawn from this bill, I've used the definitions by the War Memorials Trust and the Imperial War Museum, and that is to replicate the definition that was used in the private members' bill brought forward by Jonathan Gullis, which we've discussed obviously led to the Section 50 of the Police Crime and Sentencing of Courts Act. In relation to a Holocaust memorial, that would be something that I'd need to reflect on. But I'm happy to have discussions, and again, I'd be able to write to the committee on this particular point, because I take exactly what you're saying, and it's something that I would like to reflect on and obviously come back to the committee.
But I think your answer, that you've described where you got the definition from, I think it reinforces for me my worry that perhaps you've decided at the beginning to focus specifically on war memorials, and you haven't explained why that specifically is the definition. For example, we've seen anti-Semitic attacks on Jewish graves. If those were not individuals who died in an armed conflict, they would not be covered. But I think most people would recognise the very same trauma, emotional impact, the cultural and social significance of those memorials. I'm going to ask a few other comparison questions. And I'm aware there's a danger that this is going to sound as though I'm trying to create a hierarchy of what's important. What I'm actually trying to do is suggest that there shouldn't be a hierarchy and that all of these things matter. There's currently a campaign to raise funds to create a memorial for LGBT veterans, people who served in the armed forces, many of whom would have died in armed conflict, but some of whom would have been persecuted, even tortured by the British Army or expelled from the British Army, and some of whom are still serving. An LGBT veterans memorial, if it was created, would not be covered in this legislation. Although if it was to a specific individual within that community who had died in armed conflict, it would be covered. There's also a campaign for a memorial to those who fought against apartheid. Now, clearly, that was an armed conflict. Well, although not everyone at the time would have agreed in this country, most people today would recognise that the ANC were freedom fighters who were taking up arms against a profoundly evil white supremacist regime. Now, if a memorial was built specifically to Nelson Mandela, for example, in Scotland, it would not be covered because he didn't die in armed conflict. But if it was built to Steve Biko, who was tortured to death in a South African prison, it would be covered. So do you understand the point that specifically focusing on war memorials seems to create a lot of anomalies and to cover some monuments? For example, you mentioned the Boer War. There would be those who point to the atrocities, the war crimes committed by the British Army in that circumstance. So there would be monuments, memorials to individuals or to groups of individuals with whom most people today would not say that it requires the same degree of respect as those in living memory or those who fought against fascism, but which would be covered by your bill. And there are monuments or memorials, either existing today or which people are seeking to create, with which most people would recognise the very same trauma and social and emotional impact that you're describing, which would not be covered. So there do seem to be a lot of anomalies to me.
I'm not sure I would accept that as a whole. What I did do at the start of the bill process was look to see how wide the definition should be broadened. What I decided to do was keep it very succinct in terms of war memorials, given that was the issue that I was looking at, the issue that I've researched, but also the issue that's been brought to me by constituents, by veterans groups, by a Denniston War Memorial group. So you'll understand how I've arrived at the definition that I have. However, that being said, if the committee does believe that we need to broaden the definition, that's something that I'd be happy to consider carefully, and obviously have conversations with members, if we approach stage 2 and move on to stage 2 of the process.
Would it be your view that a memorial to the Battle of George Square, for example, which surely was an armed conflict between workers, striking workers, and the British state, would that be covered?
Well, of course, I'm talking about war memorials. I'm talking about people who fought and died for our country in wars. And
I'm sorry. I do have to challenge that. You've already mentioned, for example, the Spanish Civil War Memorial, which has been desecrated with fascist graffiti.
Yes.
I think in Motherwell, I think the Glasgow one's been attacked as well in the past. Not people who fought for our country or for any country, people who were recruited by the Communist International to fight fascism. So this is not about one country or another, and your definition is about those who died in armed conflict.
So what I'm saying is, in terms of the definition that I've got, it was the definition that I used heavily, not just from the War Memorials Trust, but the Imperial War Museum. It was also from the Members' Bill that has been brought in through another mechanism in England and Wales, but it's also down to what I've researched and what has been brought to my attention by people who are very worried and very concerned about war memorials being desecrated in this country. And I know that we can accept that and agree on that point. I'm not disagreeing with you about broadening definitions. However, that would be a discussion that I would like to have moving forward, or indeed if that would be a discussion that committee wants to expand on should they take further evidence on this particular bill. I think it's important that we have these discussions. But again, I'm sitting with you with the bill in front of me. And of course, I do believe that if there was a desecration of a memorial, I do believe that the courts would have to consider as part of that process, what the definition of a war memorial is on that case-by-case basis as well. So I think we've got to look at all of these things in turn. Again, I'm not against looking at the broadening of the definition. I quite welcome this discussion that we're having, particularly in relation to all of the different memorials that we have in the country for various different reasons. However, the bill has been put forward given the issues that have been brought to my attention that I think are serious and deserve our attention.
Okay. I'm aware of taking a lot of time. Just one final question, which is on a potential alternative approach. The policy memorandum talks about non-legislative approaches as alternatives, but it doesn't consider an alternative legislative approach, which seems to me fairly obvious. Rather than broadening the legislation, what we have in relation to hate crime against individuals is the concept of aggravated offences. If an offence is committed and it is shown in the court that the intention is motivated by prejudice on grounds of race or sexuality or transgender identity or disability or other protected characteristics, the courts treat that as an aggravated offence and are required to take that into account in sentencing. It seems to me that if we want the courts to take into account the very real trauma that's experienced by those for whom war memorials or other memorials have a special emotional significance, or the special cultural and social significance they have for the whole country, that approach of requiring aggravated offences to be considered in relation to vandalism, desecration, whatever damage is done, that would seem to be much more flexible. It would require the courts to consider all of the circumstances in relation to the meaning, the importance of a particular memorial, and the motivation of the offender. Did you consider that alternative approach? And if not, would you?
So the approach that I've taken is primarily of deterrence, and it's something that I've referenced a lot today because I do believe that this is what the bill could achieve. It's to make sure that people would think twice about desecrating a war memorial given its significant importance in our communities. In relation to what you're saying, it is an interesting concept. I'm not entirely sure that would be maybe the right fit for a war memorial. However, you know, again, these discussions could be broadened out if the bill reaches stage 2. Also, you know, in terms of this particular point, I think this could be similar to the offence of a high court. Right now, what I'm trying to say is that it fits under, you know, a sort of sheriff court level. So what I wouldn't want to do is, you know, increase that as well. I think it's important that we're using the right levers of our court system in order to make sure that if a sentence is necessary, if a sentence is fitting of the crime, that it's handed out proportionally. And I think that's really important as well. So I think we've got to look at all of this. I'm not saying that these discussions shouldn't be had. It could be something, again, the committee, if they wish to, could explore. But for me, I do believe that what I'm setting out here is the best course of action in order not just to raise the importance of the significance of war memorials, but of course the impact that these crimes have on communities, on veterans, on our armed forces as well.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Mr Brown?
Yeah, thanks very much. I think the member will probably get a flavour of the fact that members of the committee are quite keen to pursue what may be seen to be fairly niche issues, but it's to become law, so it's really important that we get these facts right. And I'm just thinking about the nature of war memorials in Scotland. There's a study done by Stirling University about 5 or 6 years ago which showed there is no standard war memorial in Scotland. After the First World War, every community decided, some had Celtic crosses, others did it in terms of rank, and something I've never favoured, putting officers and seniority first. So there's no standard way in which a war memorial is constructed in Scotland, so there are different types. Now, next week I'll attend a ceremony in my old unit where a name is to be added to one of the war memorials from a guy that died in training. And his name will probably go alongside 4 other guys from our troop who were killed in the Falklands. So they will have been killed in an armed conflict. He wouldn't have been. So I'm just making that point to say war memorials are very different. They're not a standard thing. But that particular war memorial will be at my old base. I understand that your amendment you're bringing forward will not impact that because the public can't get access to that in any event. So that will be excluded from this bill. Is that right?
Correct, as it stands. Again, this could be looked at further. I tried to make sure that the bill was as clear and succinct as it possibly could be. But again, you know, reflecting, and that's why I wrote to the committee about places of worship, for example, and I would be keen to hear from members, just like the example that you've rightly pointed out, if there's any other instances that we could look at in terms of the scope of the bill.
It would seem to me that if it's not accessible to the public, which military bases generally are not, then they would be excluded. On the point about deterrence, you said, and I agree with you, that it seems very unlikely that any court would give somebody 10 years in prison for defacing, in whichever way, a war memorial. I think, as Patrick Harvey's pointed out, the idea that some of the most egregious examples of rape or child abuse would attract a lesser sentence is unlikely to be supported by a court. If you believe that, I believe that, then presumably some of the potential transgressors in relation to this will also know it's very unlikely the court is going to hand down a 10-year sentence. So is that not in itself undermine the idea of a deterrent, because it seems extremely unlikely? And also, if you think about it, 10 years in jail costs the taxpayer about £500,000, whereas if they were to be forced, I think as Neil Bibby is suggesting, to rectify, you know, at their own hand, to put right what they did, or some other form of community payback, would that not be more effective than charging the taxpayer £500,000?
So in terms of the financial memorandum that I've set out in the bill, I don't estimate that there's going to be a large number of cases. I've estimated, I think, a maximum of 10 new cases per year of being prosecuted in the courts. And whilst it's difficult, I think, to predict numbers, if we're talking about numbers and hypotheticals, evidence from the comparable offences in England and Wales suggests that prosecutions in itself would be rare. So I think that hopefully provides you with a little bit of comfort here. I think the deterrent is strong in terms of what I'm setting out in the bill. Of course, what I'm trying to do as well is bring in what's already happening in England and Wales. This isn't something brand new. And again, it's to make sure that we are elevating the status of a war memorial, which I know we all agree are of significant importance for our communities, but it's making sure that the emotional harm is also encompassed into the crime, because right now it is purely financial. Usually when the courts are going through the process, the outcome usually relates to the cost of the damage to the war memorial. What I'm trying to do with this particular bill is make sure that the emotional impact is also brought forward as part of the court process in terms of any potential prosecution. But I must stress, given the information that I've got from what's already happening in England and Wales, the suggestion is that the prosecutions in itself would be rare. But again, it's showing people that desecration of a war memorial is wrong, that we don't accept it in society, and there could be severe consequences for your actions if you do decide to desecrate a war memorial.
Thanks for that. My last point really is that I think, as you just said, there seems to be almost unanimity that certainly members of the armed forces and veterans would find it appalling that people would want to deface a war memorial. However, it's also true to say that a lot of veterans I know find it very patronising when they're all lumped together and said to have the same point of view, and we know that's not the case, either of members of the armed forces or veterans. And there are a number of veterans I've spoken to, and I'm referring to their views now, who say that this really is performative virtue signalling, because there's existing legislation that allows for the prosecution of people who do this. And many other issues to do with training or housing or other issues that armed forces and veterans are concerned about are more worthy of time being given to them in terms of parliaments and governments. So I just wonder what you would say to those veterans who have that view.
I would agree the fact that we should be looking at veterans' housing and other needs of veterans. That, of course, is a job for the Scottish Government, and I would hopefully encourage through this and raising the issue of war memorials that the Government would continue to do more for our veterans. It's something that shouldn't be a political football. We should all be able to get behind and support our veterans without involving the politics behind it. I don't see this as, performative. This has been brought to me by a group who were devastated, and I mean devastated, that their war memorial was desecrated in the way that it was. That's not politicking. That is me taking on the concerns of a group of people who wanted this Parliament to do more for them. That's why I'm here today. I'm not here for the politics. I'm here to try and do some good. And it's some good for our communities. It's some good for people who are genuinely impacted when these war memorials are desecrated. I don't think there's any way that you can politicise that whatsoever. And what I've tried to do with this bill is engage cross-party. I've not tried to make this, a party issue, and I've met with 2 cabinet secretaries to try and discuss this bill to see if there was any particular lever that we could utilise to try and find a way around the issues that we're experiencing. We've of course had the Denniston War Memorial Group who have brought forward the petition. They're desperate to see changes to the law, and this is what I'm trying to achieve through their work, and it is through their hard work. So yes, my face might be on the bill, but this isn't a bill for me. This is a bill for people who have contacted me and who want this Parliament to do something about it.
Yeah, I'll just clarify that the veterans are referring to that spoke to us never mentioned anything about politics or anybody doing anything politically. They just thought in terms of prioritisation of issues affecting veterans and members of the armed forces, that was their issue. It wasn't about politics. That was all. Convener, thanks.
If I could finish following up on the issue that at the heart of my concern at the moment is about the definition of a war memorial. So also in Wishaw we have a Covenanters memorial. Obviously they don't have names associated with that, but would that be considered a war memorial? It's quite frequently, with its position in a country park, quite frequently defaced.
I understand exactly where you're coming from, and again, going back to the definitions that I've set out prior, it is relating back to armed conflict, and I think that's something that I have specified within the bill itself. I think, again, trying to make the bill as concise and clear as possible. I've tried not to expand on definitions too broadly, because again we can get into a debate on this. I've tried to make it as targeted as possible, given the issues that have been brought to me on the back of community groups and on the back of veterans as well, who have spoken to me, who are deeply concerned about the number of war memorials being desecrated. Again, these would be discussions that, should the principle of the bill pass at stage 1, that we can certainly have at stage 2. But I think it's important, to reflect on the evidence today, which I certainly will do. I'll take that away. But again, it would go back to the definitions that I've already set out within my opening statement, and again, what I've said to committee members here this morning.
Yeah, it's almost, it opens up so many questions about it. So if we consider Belhaven Park, which is itself a memorial park, and the trees that were planted by Lord Belhaven at the time of the Napoleonic Wars were a war memorial in themselves, but not necessarily of the
Yes.
description that were,
Yes.
the equivalent. And also, I think from a post-industrial area as well, I mentioned that I have family who lost their lives in the First World War, but my grandfather didn't go to war because he was a steel worker. And there was also the miners in the area who their war efforts were the same. And we've seen the stealing of the statue at Auchingeek in terms of the mining disaster there. But we also have a steelworkers memorial now in our constituency as well. And whether those that contributed to the war effort would also be protected in that. Although I understand that for veterans and for the families, it's a slightly different situation.
Yes, I mean, given the research that I've undertaken, for me, it was the stark increase on the desecration of war memorials specifically that led to the creation of this bill. So that's why I've stuck to war memorials specifically on this issue. Again, I'm not trying to say that one is more important than another, but given the level of desecration that has taken place on these particular memorials, this is the reason why I'm here in front of you today, because it is an issue that I believe deserves more scrutiny from the Parliament, and indeed stronger protections, not just again for the memorials themselves, but of course the impact that it has with everybody who are impacted directly by desecration of war memorials.
Okay. Mr Adam, you wanted in? Just finally.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, Megan. I just thought, I can understand where you're coming from, because we've the cenotaph in Paisley, and I know how much that means to the community as well. But like the convener, equally, we have a religious Covenanters memorial as well, and we have a memorial for the 1820 insurrection martyrs as well. Now, I'm not going to ask you the question again because you've answered it. You're willing to look at it at stage 2 if people were going to bring something along these lines. So I'm not going to go on about that. But I'd like to go on about the deterrence aspect of it, because there might be some who will actually, who are minded to do it for a political reason, or for a personal reason to get a point across. You might be creating a bigger platform for them. If they believe that the actual the 10 years is not going to happen and they're not going to end up in the jail, the deterrence might not be there for them to actually just give them a bigger platform. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's not for me to hand the sentences. That would be for the courts. And again, it could be a nasty shock for someone, given the level of crime, if that is what the result of the court process ends up being. For me, it's about, again, lifting the status of war memorials, protecting the status of war memorials through the deterrence, but also giving courts the levers, if they so wish to do, to provide tougher sentences if the crime fits what the sentence provides. So it's looking at it all in the round. We've obviously spoken about education this morning, which I think is a hugely important part of this. I think even having the opportunity to come before you as a member to the committee to actually talk about this even raises the profile of what has happened in recent years itself. So I think all of this combined is a start, but I think we do need tougher and stronger sentences that, should the desecration be severe, that the sentencing will be proportionate, because at present it might not be in some instances.
Yeah, because I'm not trying to be cynical. Well, I'm cynical, but the point is that someone that has made that decision to do something will just see sheriff court's better than a smaller court. You know, bigger platform, more newspapers, more people there to listen to what they've got to say and do. And if the actual sentence at the other side is something that they don't fear, then, you know, there's a bit of a... I'm not going to labour that point, but we can discuss that as things go on. But the other point I'm going to say is, from the other aspect, those that are in here today that support your bill and what is this, will there not be a disappointment that the bill's saying that there's a potential 10 years, but it's unlikely to happen?
But it's not out with the realms of possibility. Again, it's not for me or for any of us as MSPs, politicians, to be determining what an appropriate sentence would be. That, of course, is for
no, but you get what I mean.
And it
you
is
get what I
important
mean,
that
Megan.
is
I'm trying to say
separated.
that people in certain communities will be sitting there saying that's a disgrace, they should get the full whack here. They'll understand what it is. And if it's unrealistic, then people's kind of impression of the bill, of what the Act, if it becomes an Act, is going to be disappointment.
I don't believe that that would be the case, because it could still happen. You know, it depends on what the situation is, you know, how the crime happened, and of course the severity involved as well. And I don't think that's something that I could overall, you know, come to a conclusion on today, or, you know, at any point, because it isn't for me to determine, and it isn't for any of us to determine.
No, I get
the
that.
fact that the 10 years is there means that that is a possibility, and it's now not out with the realms of possibility. And again, if it is the case that even lower penalties take place, that would still be higher than what we're actually seeing at present in relation to convictions on the back of desecration of war memorials. So I think we've got to look at this in the round. It's not just about looking at the worst case scenario or the most severe penalty. It's looking at, you know, can we look at this within the justice system, and can we make sure that those who have, you know, committed this egregious crime, this crime that's really caused trauma on our communities, actually gets a sentence that's worth the harm that they've caused. And I think that's, you know, that's the purpose of my bill, is to make sure that there are penalties there to replicate the crimes that have been committed, but also making sure that that deterrence is there. Because again, I think if maybe one or two people are convicted, others would think again.
I think that concludes our questions this morning. Can I thank you very much for coming to committee, and the officials that attended as well. We are going to suspend for 5 minutes and then go into private session. Thank you.